One award-winning journalist decided recently to review any study of mental illness he could find about recovery, and particularly long-term recovery. The patterns he found were not what he'd expected.
Now, the understanding is that people who have a first episode of psychosis or a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that's a chronic deteriorating disease, and basically you're screwed. It's just going to be a bad long-term course. Well, the first thing you discover that's really surprising is the chronicity story really isn't warranted. So if you look back from 1945 to 1955, the decade before Thorazine comes in, and you look at first episode schizophrenia patients, these people are hospitalized. If you follow first episode cohorts, 70% would be out in about 12 to 18 months. And 5 years later, somewhere between 65 and 75% would be living independently in the community. They would be working. Many would be married. Even at this disorder we say is the most severe, you actually see a lot of people recovering. Now you might say, oh, listen, that's the old days. They diagnosed schizophrenia differently then. That's not a group so ill. Well, we have one modern study that followed schizophrenia patients for at least 15 to 20 years, starting in 1980. And there, of the people who got off their medication, which was a fair number, almost half, of schizophrenia patients, over half were working by the end of 5 years and stayed working the next 10 years. Over 70% weren't psychotic anymore long term. There was about 25-30% that remained actively psychotic. So even with this disorder we say that is so difficult, you actually see a lot of recovery in what we might call the natural course of outcomes. So think about that. More than half working, 2/3 in relationships. That's a vision of, quote, psychosis/schizophrenia we've totally lost. Now that's schizophrenia. How about affective disorders? How about depression? How about manic depressive illness, which we call bipolar today? Well, you go back and here's what you read in 1965. Depression will get better. It's self-limiting. We need to use the drugs to help speed that up. But you're going to get better. That's number one. And how about its long-term course? Depression is an episodic illness, and very few people become chronic. It's seen as episodic. It's seen as something that hits you for a time and then generally goes away. After 4 months, after 6 months, after 8 months, it's gone, and you're back to what's called euthymia, which is an absence of those symptoms, and you go on with your life. If you look at first episode depressed patients, hospitalized for depression, okay? Out of that first episode cohort, maybe 20% would end up chronically ill. The other 80% would have an episode, and maybe 3 years later they'd have another episode, but it was an episodic illness. Manic depressive illness, same thing. Seen as an episodic illness, and in 1969, the leading manic depressive expert in the country said, listen, the one thing we can tell parents is it's not likely to be chronic, whether it's depression or mania. Now we say, hey, your kid's screwed. You're going to be chronic. Well, if we go back and try to discover the natural course of outcomes, you see that psychiatric disorders, even severe ones, by and large are episodic. In other words, they do get better from whatever the psychiatric distress is, including you'll see people getting better from psychosis, mania, depression, whatever it might be. It might take them longer, but you see people getting better with great regularity. You actually see a lot of them staying well with great regularity, okay? And maybe it's that they actually learned something, they went through a process, and they came out the other side a little bit stronger. Who knows? I mean, I think actually that's one of the possibilities.
The message is that your client, your patient, the person you're sitting with, is not to be underestimated. Growth and development are possible. There is no such thing as permanently stunted growth. The person sitting, drooling, catatonic, hearing voices, diagnosed as schizophrenic, is struggling in a human way just as anybody else, albeit more severe. But nevertheless, the struggle is very basic to us all, and the capacity to grow and develop is present in everyone.
I know people who have been diagnosed schizophrenic. I know people who have been diagnosed bipolar, severely depressed, and suicidal, and people who have recovered. And they've gone on to lead happy lives. And that's not that uncommon for people to do that if they do that work, but it's hard work. It doesn't happen in 12 sessions with your HMO. It's going to take, potentially, it could take a year, it could take 2 years, it could take 3 or 5 years. But in 3 or 5 years, if I told you that, hey, you're going to end up not having strained reasoning anymore, and you're not going to have hallucinations, and you're not going to hear voices, but you're going to be functioning like the rest of America for the most part, and you're going to be happy for the next 50 years of your life, you probably would sign up for it.
So what can we take away from all this? To review, in addition to the discoveries in brain science mentioned earlier, major clinical research findings over the last 40 years have provided increasing cause for hope in the possibility of recovery. Summarizing these studies, one Surgeon General report stated, biological and clinical findings, one researcher concluded, have converged to increasingly confirm that recovery and empowerment are not the privilege of a few, but a process that is possible for everyone to embark on and find help with. In the United States, one White House report on mental health begins with this statement: "We envision a future when everyone with a mental illness will recover." In referencing this kind of a statement, let's be careful of one thing. For someone who is hurt for a long time, naive promises of quick turnaround and sudden recovery can be painful and confusing. In its deepest sense, recovery usually takes time. One research team writes, "Recovery is not linear. Recovery takes place as a series of small steps." An eating disorder research team points out that successful recovery doesn't reflect absolute, unwavering resolution, as much as a determination that ebbs and flows like the tides of the ocean as it gradually rises. In other words, over time, people are capable of recovery even in the midst of the changes and challenges of real life, a messiness that sometimes includes stumbles and heartbreaking setbacks. As with eating disorders, this is also true for depression, for delusions, for anxiety, for addictions, and many other challenges. These researchers go on to speak of a back-and-forth rhythm of recovery that comes in waves. Another separate research team has actually developed an approach known as the tidal model that has now been put into practice across several countries. Based on years of research into what people need, this approach focuses on encouraging families to create together the next step for recovery, with the helper and the person working together to construct an appreciation of what needs to be done now. Okay, so recovery doesn't happen overnight, but the evidence is encouraging and suggests that real recovery can happen even in tough cases. Sounds exciting, right? Well, surprisingly enough, for a variety of reasons, there is remarkably little public awareness of any of this.
What strikes me, what is so strange, honestly, is how few individuals have ever heard of the changeability of their brain, or that gene expression can turn on and off depending on what we do, or that long-term recovery is possible. Every person I speak with who struggles with mental or emotional disorder has heard from someone or somewhere that their condition is lifelong. It's really remarkable.
Someone told me recently that recovery is an outmoded, old-fashioned concept. I thought about that and I became angrier and angrier, and I said, how in the world could you withhold from someone the possibility that no matter how sick they are, that they couldn't recover to their highest level possible? And I'm not wanting to say that the challenges of serious mental illness aren't significant, but I have never met someone with serious mental illness that I did not see some flicker of hope in. And that's all you need, is some flicker in order to help someone move forward and strive for recovery.
Compared to the view of recovery we discussed earlier, this view is different. Rather than only focusing on coping and managing, this view of recovery aims, as one psychiatrist puts it, at regaining membership in society with meaningful roles and a sense of being a whole person. This kind of a deep and genuine recovery means, he continued, that the person is not considered sick by others around him.
I now define recovery for myself as really recovered. I have a life like everybody else's. I have a job that I love. I got the education I desired. I own a home, the respect of my neighbors and my friends and my family. And I'm just a human being like everybody else, not different. Every person has challenges.
Who of us isn't broken in some way? Who of us doesn't need to learn how to live life despite our challenges? Recovery is that restoration of relationship, restoration of basically the natural state of being. We all are meant to be in community, being fulfilled, not just living, but really articulating our dreams, developing it into a narrative, and moving forward with it.
Recovery is just that journey where you become more and more aware of who you are and how much you have within you that is strong and beautiful. It was like a rebirth. It was like being reborn again.
I have no problem with calling these conditions mental illnesses. It illustrates that there's something really happening in the body. It illustrates that it's not just something you can snap out of it and just choose out your way out of it spontaneously. My confusion and what I don't understand is why, when we talk about mental illness, we have to use a metaphor of physical illness that never goes away. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of illnesses in the physical world that we can heal from, we can get better from, including cancer. I've had family members who have overcome cancer and it's in remission. But when we talk about mental illness, typically we compare it with type 1 diabetes, where you have a long-term need for insulin. Why? Let's use the labels, but let's use the labels thoughtfully. Let's use them carefully and in a way that doesn't put people in boxes, but that helps them move along.
Yeah, I think the message for families and those going through this is don't accept the pessimistic story that if you have this crisis, this is going to be you forever. Really what history and science are telling us is that many people can have a psychiatric event. It may be extended and it may be very difficult, but what history and science is telling us is there's actually this extraordinary resilience in people, and if you make environmental changes, people can generally come out of that psychiatric distress. That's the optimistic message.
For whatever reason, that optimistic message is something most people facing mental illness simply have not heard. If that doesn't seem quite right to you, it didn't to us either, especially when you consider what knowing this could mean for those facing these kinds of problems. So how about spreading the word? First, research shows the brain is changeable. Second, research shows people recovering long-term, depending on how exactly they approach the problem. Any questions? This concludes our first section of the class, all centered around the question, how do we make sense of these problems? In the next section, we will turn our attention to that other question we just mentioned. So how should we approach and respond to these problems? What should we do about them? To recap this last class and introduce the next, we'd like to finish with one final word.
And by the way, there's this beautiful quote by Samuel Bachoven. Now, Samuel Bachoven was head of Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And he goes back to the 1940s, and he's still there in the 1970s. And he says this, and listen to this. He says, my experience has taught me that most mental disorders, especially the most severe, are largely self-limiting in nature unless we do something to turn them chronic. So that's the perception of this doctor, and I think that is really the one line that we need to rediscover. Largely episodic, self-limiting, unless we do something to turn them chronic. Unfortunately, we're doing a lot to turn them chronic.